Dr. Bart Ehrman, good to be talking with you again. We've had some good conversations.
Yes,
If
we
you
have. And
Yeah,
I'm sure
I'm
none
really
as good as
appreciative.
this one will be.
One of the things that I get from the young Earth creationist theologians that I so often argue with is, all of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses.
Hmm.
And that's what I'd like to talk to you about again today, in just a moment. But I understand you got a seminar, another.
Yeah,
Well, promote that for us,
I
please.
will. I'm happy to. It's actually it's an 8 lecture course devoted to one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Luke. Luke is maybe maybe the most neglected of the Gospels in some ways, and it's a real mistake because it's a very interesting Gospel that in many ways disagrees on key points with its predecessors, Matthew and Mark. And so my my eight lectures over the course of 2 days. It will be on May 10th and 11th. Course of 2 days. There'll be two Q&As, one at the end of each day. I'll give 4 lectures a day. My lectures are going to be dealing with how to understand the Gospel of Luke and how to see how different it is, and in very important ways. And so it's being called the Maverick Gospel, Luke the Maverick Gospel. And I'll be showing that Luke says things that people, people will be surprised at. I mean, I'll give you one example if that's okay. As people do not notice this. Luke, the Gospel of Luke, does not talk about Jesus' death as bringing an atonement for sins. In Luke, Jesus does not die for you. What? What? I thought this was a Christian gospel. It definitely is a Christian gospel, and it definitely has a different understanding of why Jesus died than you get in Matthew, Mark, and John. And so that can be shown. And so you don't have to take nobody has to take my word for it. What they if they come to this thing, they'll see why I'm saying that, and then they can decide for themselves.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. As I mentioned, the the, the apologists that I normally argue with insist that these gospels were written by eyewitness accounts, and that makes them absolutely unquestionable because they think that eyewitness accounts are the most reliable form of evidence. And I remember there was some scholar that was telling me that there was actually a chance that Luke might actually have been written by Luke. And so I want to ask you that first. What is your opinion on that?
Well, one I've got lots of opinions about. One opinion is that if that's true, if it was written by Luke, then it was not written by an eyewitness because Luke was not an eyewitness. The person to whom the gospel is ascribed is a Gentile who did not live in Israel, who was a traveling companion of Paul 20, 30 years later, who says that he says that he did a lot of research and that's how he got his information. So he was not an eyewitness and doesn't claim to be an eyewitness. Um, so uh, the traditional description is to a person named Luke, who traditionally is thought to be a companion of Paul. So he's not even a companion of one of the eyewitnesses. I mean, Paul also wasn't a follower of Jesus during his lifetime. Um, but the grounds for thinking that it was this particular person, Luke, a Gentile physician who traveled with Paul, is based on very thin evidence, and everybody says it just because they've been saying that since about the year 180, literally. But for the first 100 years, it was in circulation. There was no name attached to it, and the author himself doesn't call himself Luke or anything else. It's anonymous.
Okay. So, and this was the only one that might have been written by the person that was named. And in that case, that wouldn't have been an eyewitness. But the others, just to recap, Matthew, Mark, John, these were not eyewitnesses either,
Well,
right?
if Mark was the author of Mark, then he also was not an eyewitness, because the idea with Mark is that he was a companion of Peter, so he wasn't an eyewitness. Matthew is thought to be the tax collector who Jesus calls in Matthew chapter 9, and John is thought to be the beloved disciple of the Gospel of John, but neither author claims to be that person. And when they talk about those persons in the third person. So whoever writes Matthew talks about Matthew being called as an apostle. It doesn't say I was called or give any indication he's talking about himself. And the same with John. And so um, there are lots of reasons for thinking they were not by eyewitnesses, but it would take a long time to explain that. And there's lots of reasons for thinking that if they were eyewitnesses, that doesn't mean that they're accurate any more than, I mean, if eyewitnesses were always accurate, we would not need a judicial system. You could
Yeah.
just ask an eyewitness what they saw, and then you'd send the guy to jail because that guy saw it. And so it doesn't work that way. So I have a full book on this. I've got a book called Jesus Before the Gospels, where I talk about why people claim these things are by eyewitnesses, what the evidence would be for it, and what the overwhelming evidence is against it, and whether and how these people got their stories, and how the fact that we know how memory works affects what we know about their memories and how well they could remember these things.
Then there's also the way that each of these things, and especially with Luke, the way that they're put together, it often reads to me that they come from different origins, that all of these are just short stories that were compiled for each of the Gospels. These are just a collection of short stories that are just kind of jammed in there. And that's why we sometimes have them seemingly repeat elsewhere, or maybe even twice in the same thing. So, and sometimes, like with Luke, I notice that it starts in first person, but it doesn't stay there. It's like you said, when it suddenly switches to second or third person,
Yeah.
confusingly. So tell me, if you can, tell me a little bit more about what you've noticed is that maybe this is not all one cohesive. This isn't one document that one guy sat down and wrote down all at once,
Yeah.
right?
Well, it kind of depends how what one means by that. I mean, so you're right. The first four verses, he's talking about why I'm writing this. That's okay. That's how ancient historians would start their works. They'd start out by saying, "Oh, yeah, the people written about this, but they really didn't do a very good job, and so now I'm going to give you the right report." And that's almost exactly what Luke says. That there have been others who've written accounts of Jesus' life, but he's followed it accurately, and so he's going to give you the right account. Okay, so he says that in the first four verses, and then he launches into his account, which is all in the told about other people. You're right that when you get into the gospel itself, there are like it's one thing happens and then it ends happening, and then the next thing, then the next thing, and within a chapter there'll be like 4 or 5, 6 like events happen that don't seem to have any necessary relationship to each other. So scholars actually have a name for this. They call those pericopes. A pericope literally means cut around. You can like cut it out and you'd have the whole thing contained. Like each pericope has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then you get to the next one, it's a beginning, middle, and end. And what scholars have thought for over a century now is that the reason for that is that these authors are taking accounts that have been in oral tradition, that have been circulated by word of mouth. And so you might have a story about Jesus walking in the water. You might have a story about Jesus feeding the 5,000. Story about Jesus giving a particular sermon. Jesus healing somebody. And so these are separate stories that are just people are telling these stories. And then the gospel writers put them together and try to make a narrative out of it. So it seems very episodic. It's like this, and that. And it's because the origins were probably episodic.
And I remember one of the Gospels, if I remember correctly, said something along the lines of, that there simply wasn't room in the Bible to tell all of the stories
Yeah, yeah,
that were attributed to Jesus.
yeah.
And it seems to me like there's a bunch of little snippets being cut in there, like a bunch of urban legends or whatever, or that they're parables in themselves. Because, like with the thing about the devil trying to tempt Jesus, that was one that always bothered me, even as a child when I read that, because trying to assume at that stage of my life that this is based on something that really happened, that there was really a devil there talking to Jesus, it was impossible for me to think that those were the devil's actual words.
Right, right. Yeah. Who is taking notes exactly? I know. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
But you
not
know,
just that, it's just that it's the things that the what the devil would have known, or
yeah,
Satan, whichever we want to call it, what he would have known and what he would have said with that knowledge. These are not those words.
yeah.
You know, this is
Right.
this is somebody who's strawmanning the devil's position. That was the impression that I got reading it as a child.
Yeah. Well, it's why biblical scholars, most of whom are Christians, I'm not, but I'm kind of the rare bird. Um, most of our Christians think that if you're reading these Gospels, the temptation in the wilderness, just to see what actually happened, as if like knowing the facts of what actually happened is somehow matters much, that's an impoverished way of reading these texts, because this passage about the temptations is actually really interesting if you try to understand what's going on in the interchange between Jesus and the devil. And the author is trying to communicate a meaningful lesson by this. He's not trying to recount like history the way it actually happened. If you understand his history and how it's happened, it doesn't make any sense. The devil takes him up to a tall mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of earth because he's on such a tall mountain. How tall would a mountain have to be to see all the kingdoms on earth? You can't. There's no mountain
Well,
tall enough. The
by
world's right.
by the description, every kingdom on earth would be able to see the top of that mountain.
Yeah, well, exactly. And so, but so it's these are being the author is trying to communicate something that's important to him, but it's more of a theological lesson than a historical lesson. And somebody who's a Christian should pay attention to the theological message rather than trying to make it out like this is actually something that happened as if, like that's the thing. I don't think that's really the thing with these texts.
Well, I was taught that the Bible is God's word,
Yeah.
God's infallible word,
Yeah.
and that if I read that, then I would get to tap into this divine wisdom, and that's what I as a child was trying to do.
Yeah.
I was reading the Bible not to criticize it. I was reading the Bible because I was seeking wisdom, which sadly I did not find.
Well, you know, uh, but I do think that reading it for wisdom instead of reading it for what actually happened is a better way to do it. Even if God inspired it. So I don't believe in God, but when I went to a theological seminary and I had a very conservative professor there who was absolutely convinced the Bible was inspired by God. But his view was, well, who said God can't inspire a myth? Why can't God inspire a legend? Why are you telling God he has to write only history books? I think that's a pretty good point, actually. If you're a believer, you just say, okay, it's not something that actually happened. It's trying to teach something to you.
Conversely, the people that I argue with typically will say that God controls absolutely everything. Who wins the game, whether you find your car keys. I mean, whatever happens because He wanted it to happen. Even when you try to analyze what God would have had to have done for this to happen, means at some point somebody had to lose their free will. God has to manipulate people at some point in these courses of events in order to cause these things to happen. But nobody thinks that deeply about it. But they'll say that God can control absolutely every teeny little thing to the nth degree. But for whatever reason, the one thing He can't control is evolution.
Yeah, right. I know. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, but they since they believe in the literal truth of the Bible, it's not they have other reason for getting rid of evolution. But I mean, of course. So when I was 17, that's what I thought too. But I was 17, and you ought to kind of grow beyond the kind of things you think when you're 17. And the idea that God controls everything leads to huge problems. Like,
Mhm.
does He control whether you have faith or not? Well, yes, of course. Okay, so He controls whether you don't have faith. Yes, of course. So He decides that you're going to go to hell. You're not deciding; He's deciding. Well, yeah, but He's just. Yeah, well, what's justice in making you do something that's going to condemn you? And so, yeah, it's a huge problem. But if somebody isn't willing to think, then they're not going to think.
And the Quran makes this very similar point a whole bunch of times, more explicitly, that God actually decides who is going to believe and who won't. And so God is deciding who's going to be damned for not believing, as the people He decided would not believe. We
Well,
don't
and
even have any free
the
will.
scary thing is that means that 6 billion people in the world, God is sending to hell, just for the heck of it, apparently, because He could.
Evidently.
Yeah.
So on the contrast of Luke versus these other gospels, and when I took a course I mentioned to you before, Professor Mark Hanshaw was running this course on history of comparative world religions. And when we get to the Judeo-Christian aspect of this, it was based entirely on your work. He cited you a bunch of
Oh,
times. So
okay.
just to remind the viewers that I went to a class that was based on your collective works at the time. And he was talking
Okay.
about how the different gospels were trying to portray Jesus in a different light. That he's in one he's a savior, and that he's the new Moses, he's the new David, or he's in John he's God.
Okay.
Right? Do you agree with that analysis?
Well, kind of. Yeah. I mean, basically, yes. I think they all four have different portrayals. Yes.
Okay, so with regard then to Luke, how would you say that Luke is trying to portray Jesus differently than the others?
I'd say in a lot of ways, but the way I usually characterize it to my undergraduates is that Luke is more concerned to show that Jesus is a prophet, like the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. When he's born, his birth narrative sounds a lot like the birth of the prophet Samuel. When he does miracles that are almost the same miracle that Elijah, the prophet, does. He himself says that he has to go to Jerusalem because that's where the prophets get killed. And so, like, you have event after where this prophet thing comes out, and it's only in Luke. So, I don't think the other gospels would deny that Jesus is a prophet. Luke would not deny that he's the Son of God, or that he's the Messiah, but he wants to emphasize that he's a prophet. Um, and in some ways, Luke emphasizes the humanity more than the other gospels do. In my course, I'm going to be showing why there are good reasons for thinking that Luke thought that Jesus became the Son of God when he got baptized. Uh, Whoa, really? Yeah,
Yeah, Jesus was already when his family did the Home Alone thing, and they left someplace and forgot that they left their kid behind and had to go back and get him. When he says, did you not know that I would be in my father's house?" Where he's like teaching the teachers, that
yeah,
sort of thing.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I forgot what Jesus was already showing all of these attributes before
Oh,
he was baptized
oh,
by John.
yeah, yes. The problem is that, so what I'm going to be trying to show is that Luke probably originally did not have chapters 1 and 2, the birth narratives. 1 and 2 is where Jesus is born, but then it ends with him as a 12-year-old in the temple. And I think that Luke originally started with what's now chapter 3 with the baptism. And there's a really good, this is not like my idea. This has been out there. And there's really good reasons for thinking it. Here's one thing to think about for people who are saying, what? But notice where Luke's genealogy is. So Matthew has a genealogy of Jesus, you know, descended from Abraham, descended from David, his father was so and so, father and so and so, goes down to, and Luke has it too. Matthew has it where you'd expect a genealogy when Jesus is born. Luke puts his genealogy in chapter 3 when Jesus is 30 years old. Why is he giving a genealogy when he's 30? Why not? I mean, it has to do where, his bloodline, not, and so, well, there are reasons for it. And that's like one thing to think about, but I'm going to be exploring why I don't think probably it originally had chapters 1 and 2.
Well, thank you very much again. That's our time. Everybody, check out the seminar. The details will be in the description below. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.